made your life difficult, and they've done everything they can do to attack your income. And I recently saw a video about Ernst Sundel, and the JDL was protesting Ernst Sundel, and they did very much the same thing to him. They were like Nazis. They were, screaming, yelling, attacking him physically. He had to have police around him. Professor Kevin McDonald from UCLA, I've read some of his writings, and he says that Jews hated America when it was just Catholic and Protestant and Jews, and that this is a strategy of theirs to promote multiculturalism in order to reduce our power. And I wondered if you would comment on and more eloquently explain Professor Kevin McDonald's views.
Well, I think Professor McDonald could probably explain his views better than anyone else. You might consider inviting him to speak to this group. The question of the role of Jews in Gentile societies, I think, is an important one, and it's an entirely legitimate one. People who start talking about this in any way that is critical of Jews find themselves in a position of dissonance, much as I do. It's not a question that my organization, American Renaissance, has looked into. One of the reasons that we have not is that people who concentrate on the Jewish question often get so involved in that they seem to lose sight of any other factor. And I would draw a parallel sometimes to people who are that concerned about Jewish influence. I would draw a parallel between that and the way some blacks seem to think about whites. If anything goes wrong for black people, it's whitey's fault. And I think for many white Americans who see what's going wrong with their country, they're inclined to think, well, gosh, it's the Jews' fault. I think there has been a Jewish influence that has been predominantly liberal and egalitarian. I think there's no question about that. But I think that to the extent that white people are concerned about preserving their nation as a European one or as a Christian nation, they have to pull up their own socks. And I think that blaming the work of a small minority is not, that's sort of an easy way out. I think we have to look into ourselves and ask, why is it that we have been so susceptible to this kind of multicultural propaganda? I think it's more profitable to look into our own mentality, our own propensities. At the same time, I disagree with those who think that Jews have no role or no place in trying to preserve a European America. American Renaissance, my organization, has a number of very active and very positive contributions from Jews. And I think people who say, well, Jews are the enemy, Jews are no good, I think that is a bad mistake, because they are automatically ruling out people who are important allies in the struggle to maintain Western civilization on this continent. So, again, the whole question of Jews is a very interesting one, and it is one that should be possible to investigate objectively and openly without being squashed as a dissident, and Kevin McDonald has made a career of doing that. But it's not an area in which I have done much research, and I don't take a position on it generally, other than to say that I do think that it is a mistake simply to rule out any kind of cooperation from Jews who often see things essentially exactly the way I and other people do who want to preserve our country. So, if you're interested in what he says, as I say, you should consider inviting Kevin McDonald to speak to this group. I think you'd find that he has many interesting things to say.
Could you tell us who Kevin McDonald is? I haven't heard of him.
He is a professor at the University of California at Long Beach. And he has written a series of 3 books on the nature of Jewish organization. And he does take the view that at least some Jews have systematically tried to undermine any kind of sense of Western solidarity or white solidarity in the United States. I think that may be true of some number of Jews, but I think it's an exaggeration to attribute this kind of thinking to all Jews, the overwhelming majority of Jews. I think Jews have a very unusual past, of course. I mean, they were just this small Middle Eastern tribe, and it is astonishing that even without a place to call their own, 2,000 years later, they're still here. I mean, what happened to the Hivites and the Jebusites and the Ammonites and the Amalekites? All those people were important folks back in those days when the Bible was written. They're all gone now, but the Jews are still here. And they have had a most unusual history, and I think that their history explains a great deal of what they do. I don't think that most Jews are motivated by any kind of unforgiving hatred for the Western world or for Christianity. As I say, there may be some who feel that way, but Kevin MacDonald has a very, very interesting perspective on these things, and you might find him to be an interesting guest. You're next.
Thank you, and please allow me to step up to the speaker's platform. My name is Roger Pruce. I am an ordained minister, and in the concept of freedom of speech, I'd like to take this opportunity to preach to the choir. We are all Americans, and in spite of what our president says, I believe we are Christians. And we really represent what America is about. Some of us have white hair and obviously have lived in an earlier generation and an earlier culture when we see from that perspective a different paradigm than what we see now in the current generation and culture in our country. And certainly when we look at the history of the chosen people of God, we see that they had many differences of culture and their views. Because we are Christian, we have an identity in Christ. That is our true identity. And it transcends anything else. There are either those who are members of the kingdom of God who are not. That you have either been transformed and changed by the gospel, the good news. God loves you personally. And those who unfortunately have not. They are yet to discover this good news. And it is the job of those of us who have found to bring the others into the oneness of Jesus Christ. And this morning's Bible study that I had, we were in chapter 22 of the book of Acts, when Paul was taken and was having to give a defense.
Do you have a question, sir?
I am questioning our thinking.
Quickly, with a question.
Are we really thinking about our own oneness and identity rather than what God would have us to think about our true identity? I go to liberal churches, I go to conservative churches, I go into the atheists, I go out into the to the people that are homeless, and I seek to find that path towards peace. As a matter of fact, I've been praying for the peace of Israel for many years, and I've now found an opportunity to do that as a Christian pastor helping Muslims have a secular nation in Iran.
To address your question as to the oneness, I think that as far as the survival of our civilization, and of Christianity for that matter, is concerned, I think that it's important for Western nations to stay Western. In Europe today, Christians, actively practicing Christians, are increasingly a minority. But I think that if Europe is replaced by Muslims, then even that minority will be persecuted and wiped out. I think that as far as the people of the West are concerned, unless they are prepared to defend their territorial borders, unless they are prepared to maintain societies in which they can set the rules and they are the majority, then there is nothing that they hold dear that they can necessarily count on. And I think also, in France, for example, they have a movement called the National Front that is very much interested in maintaining France for the French. Now, there are quite a lot of different kinds of people. There are traditional Catholics who are members of this group, and there are pagans who are members of this group. But they all have a common interest in preserving a France that is French. And that is where they can make common cause. And their conviction is that France, in all of its traditions, religious, cultural, and otherwise, the only way to preserve that is to maintain it as a French country. I think that is the number one consideration, at least in my view.
Yeah, go ahead, podium.
Yeah, go ahead to the podium if you could. By the way, I didn't mean to be rude to him, and apologize for the abruptness of my comment. I just want to briefly say, everyone knows who the speaker is, and we sent out the postcards, and they came to hear his responses to these things, and everybody's got a lot of views, and we want everyone to have an opportunity. A lot of people don't stand in line; they'll sort of come up as the line, dwindles. So we want to make sure that as many questions as possible are asked, and it's not used as a podium to filibuster. Those of you who want to talk longer, talk to me. Maybe you can be a future speaker.
I'd just like to say, as an ordained minister, that's not a universal conviction that that last ordained minister shared. It's that thinking of Christianity that's going to destroy the West and destroy the church. My question is, with the 65 or 64 Immigration Act, that obviously changed everything. I pin the whole diversity thing, at least politically speaking, goes back to that. And so I'm asking, why do you think it is that a country that was 90% white at that time passed that kind of legislation in order to create this monstrosity that we have today?
Well, that's a very good question. The act took place in 1965. It was an immigration act that at the time was promoted by Ted Kennedy and Emanuel Seller, with the idea that it was not going to change the nature of the United States. Up until that point, the United States immigration policy was operating according to a law that had been passed in 1924, which established quotas. And the quotas were simply to maintain the national origins mix of the United States population as it was in the time of, I believe it was 1920, or there was some debate as to what the period was going to be. But the idea was to maintain the U.S. population mix as it was. Well, that was American immigration policy up until 1965. But Ted Kennedy and all of its promoters, and also Lyndon Johnson, when he signed the bill into law, they all promised that this was not going to have much of an effect on the population of the United States. So, when Congress passed that law, I feel sure that if they had had any idea just what the transformation would be, they would not have passed the law. As a matter of fact, in 1960, the United States was 90% white. By 2060, 100 years later, according to current projections, and 100 years is just a blink of an eye in historical terms, the United States is projected to have a majority of Hispanics. And whites will be about 40% of the population. If in 1965 you had explained to the senators and congressmen who were voting at that time, this is what you are opening the door to, I'm absolutely convinced that law would never have passed. Now, part of the motivation for passing that law was, it's often said, that that had to do with Cold War conflict with the Soviet Union. The United States and Soviet Union were vying for influence all around the Third World. And a lot of American liberals said, well, we can't compete with the Soviet Union if they can point to an immigration policy that excludes all of these Asians and Africans and Latin Americans that we are trying to win over to our way of life. So that was part of the motivation. I think at the same time, we had just passed what was called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 just a year before. That was the law that made it illegal to discriminate in racial terms for employment, and it made it illegal if you had some sort of public accommodation like a hotel or restaurant. It made it illegal to exclude people on the basis of race. So there was a kind of sense of, we're going to move forward racially, we're going to be one big happy family, so long as voting for this law really doesn't change anything important. So I think it was this combination of Cold War considerations, this notion that, okay, race is something, we've had racial problems, we're going to try to get over these racial problems. So it was a combination of ignorance as well as idealism that led to this vote. But again, if people had known at the time what this really was going to lead to, I'm absolutely convinced it would never have happened. Sam Nunn was a senator, I believe, from Georgia. At the time, he said he was one of the few who voted against this new law. He said, well, wait a minute. What's wrong with the people of the United States? What's wrong with preserving the racial mix of the people who founded this country and who are already here? What's wrong with that? Well, the answer to that question is there's nothing wrong with that. But at that time, he was outvoted.
First, thank you for a very interesting and invigorating lecture. And once again, I'm sure I speak for everybody, we thank John for putting this together. He's a real salt of the earth guy there. One thing that struck me in my question, I believe that there might be, I agreed with most of what you said, except for the part about intrinsically the intelligence level of the different ethnic groups is the reason for the various prosperity or the advancement. And I want to see what you think about this. If you study history, if you look at Japan and you look at China with all of these brilliant Asians, and by the way, they are brilliant. My daughter's studying Japanese, by the way, so wonderful country. And the Asians started out well. They had gunpowder, and they built the Great Wall, and of course 1 million people or whatever died building the Great Wall, so I don't know if that's a great thing or not. But once the Reformation in Christianity took root in Europe, that is when Europe vaulted ahead, and the non-Christian Chinese lapsed, and the Japanese as well, into centuries and centuries and centuries of backwardness. And I guess I'm the people that advocate the theory that the true advancement is Christianity, the Judeo-Christian worldview, where that takes hold. If you look at the history of the world, those are the nations. It isn't because they were racially different. It is because they had Judeo-Christianity. And by the way, now this is just my opinion, but I think history bears that out. Protestant countries, within Christianity, Protestant countries did better than Catholic, too. And then one could look at the Jews. They're 1% of the world's population, but they're like, what, 35% of the world's advances in medicine and all of that. So I'm interested in what you think about that, because, of course, I believe that the only color God sees is red on the cross, and in that sense, I think we're one race. Now, not throwing out that there are other differences and things like that, but he died for us all. So,
well, don't forget this question of Christianity being at the heart of the Industrial Revolution, for example.
Western civilization.
I think the point you made about Jews is an important one. They have, in terms of per capita Nobel Prize winners, they're perhaps 35 times overrepresented compared to any other group. So Christianity is certainly not at the heart of their creativity. Also, you have to realize that Europe was Christian long before the Industrial Revolution took place. I think by the year 1000, pretty much all of Europe was Christian.
Oh, I should elaborate. Remember, I said Judean Christianity, and I said it took place starting with the Reformation.
Well,
That's when they went ahead.
okay. As far as well, I just think that it would be difficult to attribute to the Reformation the Industrial Revolution. Some people have tried to make that Max Weber had this idea of Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. There may be something to that, but I don't think that is a crucial factor. When you talk about the Chinese, for example, indeed, in 1000 BC, they had a civilization that was vastly superior to anything that you could find in Europe. Also, even before Columbus, who sailed across the Atlantic in his relatively small boats, 50 years earlier than that, they had an admiral who had built these boats that were 5-10 times the size of Columbus's boats. And they had sailed to Africa, they had collected animals, they had sailed all around the coasts, but they decided that China was a perfectly good place as it was, and they ended up burning these boats. I think that one thing that makes North Asians, who are the smart Asians, different from Europeans is a lack of a certain kind of Faustian interest in going further, doing more, being creative. If the Europeans had decided, okay, we've sailed to North America now, okay, we know it's there, now we're just going to burn our boats and not go anywhere else. That's just not the way Europeans operate. Europeans want to go further, they want to know more, and I think that it is possible that although North Asians on average are more intelligent than whites, I think that the real creative breakthroughs that you find all around the world, scientifically or logically, mathematically, you do find them primarily in European countries. And it may be that despite a slight average difference in IQ, I think it's entirely possible that Europeans are more creative than Asians. The real breakthroughs come there. Now, as far as the Japanese are concerned, don't forget that they were so wound up in preserving their own civilization that for about 300 years, up until 1854, they cut off all contact with the rest of the world. They had this closed society. And yet, when they opened up to the West, in just a few decades, they were capable of arming to the point where they could beat Russia in a war, a naval engagement. They absorbed Western technology at an astonishingly rapid rate that I think is possible only because of a high general level of intelligence. I mean, compare that to the way Africa operates today. We have spent billions and billions of dollars trying to drag the Africans out of this kind of Bronze Age, Stone Age culture that they had before contact with outsiders. And we can't succeed. We've been trying to force feed them the kind of Western civilization that the Japanese picked up just like that. I think that all of this kind of historical evidence combined with the genetic and physiological evidence that I was describing earlier in my talk makes it overwhelmingly clear that there really are basic different levels of intelligence and ability among the races. And this, of course, is what explains the world that we live in today, but this is one of those things about which you dare not talk. Yes, sir.
Mr. Taylor, it's great to finally meet you in person. I'm Kyle Bristow. I've corresponded with you
Yes. How are
for a number of years, so I'm also at this event.
Yes, you
So,
are.
very good. But I did have a question for you. In Europe, a number of political parties that are nationalistic are gaining influence rather rapidly. The British National Party, Vlaams Belang, like the Northern Front, or International Front. You have the Austrian Freedom Party. What, in your mind, do you think accounts for the fact that these parties are able to take root and grow in Europe, whereas we don't have such a thing in this country?
That's a very good question. It's something that I've thought about myself. Part of it, of course, has to do with our two-party system. It's very, very difficult in the United States to establish a new party. Whereas in the European parliamentary system, if you can get 5% of the vote in many places, you can get representation in Parliament. And once you have representation in Parliament, then you can start influencing things. I think that if it were easy enough to set up new parties in the United States, people who said the sorts of things that I'm saying certainly could get 5% of the vote if they had access to the airwaves. I don't think that's at all out of the question. So part of it has to do with the kind of political system we have. The differences that Mr. Bristow pointed out are to be found in all of the English-speaking countries, really. The British National Party in Britain is really sort of fading away at this point. In Canada, in the United States, in Australia, in New Zealand, the political representation of dissidents like me is practically zero. Whereas in all of the other white countries, all the rest of Europe, the non-English speaking countries, you have a completely different, you have a different picture. Political parties that are saying not necessarily exactly the same things that I'm saying, but are straightforward about saying that we must preserve our nation and the people who established this nation. I consider this a hugely encouraging thing. One theory that I've heard about that is, aside from this parliamentary system that they have and we have not, is that Europeans have, continental Europeans, have a history of invasion, repelling invasion, having to live under occupation, throwing off occupiers, whereas Britain hasn't been invaded since 1066, Australia has never been invaded, the United States has never been invaded. The English-speaking countries haven't had this system of hating an occupier the way the continental Europeans have, which makes them much more sensitive to the idea of having to live in a situation in which they are being replaced by people who they see, and I think quite legitimately, as occupiers. So that may be one reason as well. But there are probably other, well, you know, another theory that I've heard is that Europeans, certainly more so than Americans, do not move around as much. That many people will be living in a town or even in a building that's been in their family for several generations, maybe several centuries. And that gives them much more of a sense of an attachment to where they are. Whereas Canada, the United States, Australia, we were founded by settler populations, people moving in, people moving west, people always moving, so that we may have less of a proprietary sense of attachment to our territory when compared to these continental Europeans. In any case, I don't know if that is a full explanation, but there is no question about it. We do not have a political voice for preserving a European-American United States, and many European countries do. Again, I think that's a hugely encouraging thing. And yet, even in Europe, and I find this really quite fascinating, despite the fact that, say, a country like Sweden, they never had slavery. They never had an overseas empire, and yet they still have this same sense of white guilt and white responsibility and white capitulation that we have, and we are constantly having slavery thrown in our faces, Jim Crow, all of these things. This notion of white capitulation is spread all around the white world, despite the fact that our histories are so different. But at least in Europe, continental Europe, they're able to shake off this capitulationist mentality far more successfully than the English-speaking white people have. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to mention Deuteronomy 28 says, if you disobey my law, what's happening in the United States is going to happen. You're going to be ruled by strangers, and you're going to have a foreigner over you, and you're going to be dispossessed from your own land and so on. So I think that's the way out. But my question is, you know, there's a story about a Jamaican king, and he wanted to show a visitor how powerful he was, so he ordered his soldiers to march off a parapet, you know, down to their deaths. And you would think, like, the third or fourth guy in line would, you know, be thinking, I don't want to do that, you know. And now we've watched Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia, go down. And that's all the way down, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything about Robert Mugabe's regime that you could say if there's anything left of European influence there. I mean, it's really gone all the way down. And it was a first world nation.
Right.
And now South Africa, I don't know what the percentage is it like halfway there? Or, I mean, it's really going down fast. Total barbarianization of a country. And I'm wondering, you know, how many countries have to go down before the other ones start thinking, you know, I don't want to go there, I don't want to do that. I mean, it's a question of timing, but how many countries do we have to lose, do you imagine?
Well, see, I said in my talk that I am genuinely baffled by this. You would think that all you have to do is look around, not just at Zimbabwe, not just at South Africa, but at Brownsville, Texas, at South Central LA, at Northern Philadelphia, Detroit. There are plenty of places in the United States where we can see the future. It's written as clearly as it could possibly be. I mean, Mark Twain used to say, predictions are always risky, especially when you're talking about the future. But in this case, we can see the future. It is right there. All you have to do is get off on the wrong freeway exit, and there is 2050 staring you in the face. So why is it that white people have this incapacity to see the obvious? I don't have a good answer to that question. I mean, we have been propagandized about this over and over and over. But I will say one thing. One thing that I find very encouraging is if you go to a website of an ordinary mainstream newspaper, and there will be a story about, some kind of crime that's been committed, and there's some sort of racial angle to it. The commenters, they all sound as though they have been reading my publication, American Renaissance, for the last 20 years. No, I think that ordinary Americans have a very clear view about these things. It's just that anybody who is in public office has been absolutely intimidated, and the media are in the hands of people who are bound and determined to portray us as somehow not just wrong-headed, but evil bigots and racists and Nazis. But ordinary Americans, I think, if you were to ask an ordinary white person, is America going to be a better place if whites are a minority? They say, are you crazy? Absolutely not. As I say, look at what people do. Look at where they live. Look at where they send their children to school. And yet, we have this extraordinary situation in which the majority wishes of whites are not represented in the media and certainly not represented at the political level. And you have these fanatical people who are bound and determined, as I say, not to try to debate these views, but to actually snuff them out. And you find the same thing to a lesser degree in Europe. You find these organizations that are dedicated to just shutting up the Vlaams Belang in Belgium, or shutting up the Swedish Democrats in Sweden. It's an extraordinary thing. And as I say, I don't have a fully satisfactory explanation for this. People say that it's the influence of Jews. People say that the demoralization of the First World War, the Second World War. People say it's guilt over colonialism, guilt over slavery. I think there are many factors that go into this, but I think that there's something in the nature of whites that makes them especially susceptible to an appeal to a kind of altruism. If there is a country that's not doing as well as we're doing, there's something about white people that makes them very susceptible to the idea that, well, if Mexico's poor, that must have something to do with the fact that we are rich. We've become rich at their expense.
The white man's brand.
And it's the white man. The white people have this notion that it's their responsibility to take care of the whole world. And when you think of the people who are the most concerned about saving the whales, or the snail darter, or the hoot owl, no, it's supposed to spotted owl. That's the one. White people are very concerned about this. Japanese, they're as wealthy as we are. They want to eat the whale. White people have this real concern, this sense of responsibility for the entire planet. I think that's simply part of our nature. I think that different races have different average personalities, as well as different average levels of intelligence. And you find this in the results of personality assessments, too. So I think we are particularly susceptible to this kind of appeal to altruism, to solidarity, and other races have discovered that, and they are exploiting this. But unless we are able to draw the line and say, well, no, hold on, this is for us. You, God bless you, but go develop your own society where you are. Unless we are capable of drawing those lines, we will simply be shoved aside, and no one will regret our passing.
I agree with you that knowledge is what causes advancement. My question is, just because you have a necessarily high IQ or higher IQ, it doesn't necessarily mean you get knowledge, correct? I mean,
Well, there's a very, very strong correlation. People who are intelligent tend to be curious, they tend to learn more things, they tend to be interested in learning more things. IQ is highly correlated with all kinds of desirable outcomes in society.
And then, what's your, if you don't, I mean, it doesn't sound like you necessarily agree with the Christian system as the, necessarily the right system, or the system that causes advancement. So what is your system that you believe that would, one, would get us out of this, and two, would stay out of this kind of problem?
Well, you mean the kind of multicultural, this sort of suicidal mentality that we have?
Yeah, yes, well, diversity, yes, exactly. So get out and
See,
stay out.
that's another way of asking the question, why are white people incapable, or so many of them are incapable of drawing this line? It really gets back to the same question, what is wrong with us? And again, I think that is a more fruitful question than to say, well, okay, who are our enemies, who have done this to us? If they've done it to us, it's because it was easy to do it to us. Why is it so easy to do that to us? I just don't have a satisfactory answer to that question. And I've been thinking about it for a long, long time. I think none of the proposed ideas about this are particularly convincing, not singly and even not together. But how do we get out of this? I think, again, the European example of Europeans who are now standing up and winning votes from their own people with the idea that Denmark, for example, should stay Danish, that we don't want Muslims in our country. Muslims don't fit in. Muslims are not us. You can actually run for office in Denmark on a political platform of that kind. That's a huge breakthrough. And unless we have something of a breakthrough of that kind, I think we're destined to just become this dwindling and despised minority. And as John was saying earlier, all of the things that we take for granted, such as one man, one vote, freedom of the press, equal justice for all of these things, these came out of European civilization. If you look all around the world, there are very few other people who get that kind of thing right. We take it for granted. But those are things that developed through centuries of false starts, blind alleys, wars over religion, all kinds of things that Europeans, despite their high IQ, I believe, it took them a long time to figure that stuff out. Nobody else really has figured it out. And I think that if the United States becomes majority black and Hispanic, I think we can look forward to really dramatic changes in the United States in terms of things that we take for granted. Police corruption, freedom of the press, one man, one vote. The idea that your vote, well, even now, a lot of people suspect that their votes are being ignored. I think all of that kind of thing can change dramatically. If we have a third world population, a third world Supreme Court, imagine what nothing but Elena Kagan's or nothing but Sotomayor's would decide. That's the kind of Supreme Court we're going to have when the president is invariably a Hispanic or some kind of Caribbean African. Our country will not be the same. And I think in their bones, most white people recognize this. It's just that they are terrified to talk about it, and they realize that if they speak up publicly, they can be disgraced, lose their job. But unless people are prepared to talk about it, the future that they are guaranteeing for their grandchildren is not one they would want for themselves. Yes, sir.
Thanks, Jerry. I'm an ordained pastor, too, from Jackson. I'd like you to comment on the fact that before 1960, 99% of the church in this country would have agreed with you completely. And that today, because of years of a march of cultural Marxism through our churches, the phony equality, we're doing away with distinction between men and women, between races, between culture. Now all religions are equal. And now it's led to there's no morality. All morality is equal. Gay marriage, gay people are all the same. Can you comment on the fact that the church, the liberal churches in this country and in the West, have been complicitous in our own destruction?
Well, you know, I do not agree with this view, but there are some people who have a consciousness of race, who blame churches or blame Christianity itself for this, and they point to the universal aspects of Christianity. In Christ there is no Greek, no Roman, no Jew, no Gentile. They say Christianity has been a dangerous religion because of its emphasis on universality and because of the temptation that Christians may have to think that Christianity is the main thing and race is a completely subsidiary element. I don't agree with that because for centuries Christians were just as straightforwardly nationalistic as anybody else. I mean, the the people who founded Australia and who had an explicit white Australia policy up until about 1974. It was a Christian country. And in the United States, the people who instituted slavery. I'm not saying slavery is a good thing, but slavery was not incompatible with Christianity. I mean, after all, in the Bible, there's plenty of slavery. Jesus never says, free your slaves. And what is it? Paul says, servants, obey your masters. Those servants, in many cases, were slaves. I think that there is nothing wrong with Christianity as far as preserving our civilization is concerned. I think that what has happened to Christianity, all these liberal churches you're talking about, I think that Christian churches have been poisoned the way the entire culture has been poisoned. And I think that it has nothing, it's absolutely wrong to say, well, Christianity is the root of the problem. Absolutely wrong in my view. Although there are people who say that, I think there's a larger thing going on. And I think it is something, as I suggested earlier, that is rooted in perhaps the genetic nature of whites. This notion of wanting to feel responsible, this notion of compassion, this notion of altruism, and in many cases it is a pathological altruism. An altruism that leads to suicide. But I certainly don't blame that on Christianity. I think Christian churches have just been denatured and been undermined just the way everybody else has.
Any other questions? Comments? I was struggling as you were saying, could this have developed, and would it have developed, and would it be sustained in any other third world country? We take for granted the thinking, the freedom of religion, the freedom of the press, free speech, right to assembly like this, and free market capitalism, and all of these things that are under attack. But I think the average high school senior today thinks like a third worlder. I think that the hour is late.
Very late.
Very late.
I agree.
We don't, the average white person that goes to a public school thinks like a third worlder. So, yeah, and even private school, and as you point out, even in the Christian churches, we're in trouble, bad trouble.
The fact is, in 2011, that was the first year in which non-white births outnumbered white births. So we could stop immigration tomorrow, limit it to zero, and just sit back and wait, and we will become a minority white country, simply as people get older. We're going to end up with a country in which there are an awful lot of young blacks and Hispanics and an awful lot of old white people. And if we are expecting these young blacks and Hispanics to be taxed to pay for our Social Security, think again. That is the last thing they are going to want to do. But the idea that somehow, by importing all these third worlders, we're going to keep Social Security going, we're going to keep our population growing and booming, the last thing they're going to want to do is support you in your old age, believe me.
Dr. Taylor?
Yes, sir.
Just for your future lectures, I think that we might have located a contradiction. I'm not sure. But on one hand, we're saying that the whites have an average IQ of, what did you say, 100?
100, yeah.
But yet we're too stupid to figure out what we're doing to ourselves? I mean, there's some kind of contradiction here, sir.
Well, as I say, I describe it as a form of insanity. Insanity is not the same thing as being stupid. There's a funny story about a guy who got a flat tire right next to the insane asylum. And he was changing his tire, and all of a sudden he stepped on the hubcap in which he had placed the 4 lug bolts with which he had taken off, and he tipped them over and they went down the drain pipe. So he's got no lug bolts. Well, there was a guy in the insane asylum who was sitting at the fence watching him, and the guy says, "Oh my gosh, I can't put the car back, the wheel back on my car. I'm stuck." And the guy in the insane asylum says, No. All you need to do is take 1 lug bolt off of the other 3 wheels and use 3 lug bolts to put this one on. 3 lug bolts is all you need to go a short distance, and you can get and buy 4 new lug bolts. And the guy says, "Wow, that's really brilliant." He says, "You see, being insane and being stupid are not the same thing." And I think that's our situation. We have many brilliant people, white people, not only they are brilliant, but many of them will use their brilliance really to bring down their own race, their own community, their own culture. In universities today, those people are not stupid, but they have some sort of suicidal notion about whites.
Well, I've got to add, I'd like to amend that punchline.
All right.
I mean, you missed the best one, which is the fella turns to the inmate.
Right.
And he said, wow, how'd you figure that out? And the guy says, well, I may be crazy, but I'm not stupid.
Yeah. Right. Yes, sir.
There is a difference between intelligence and wisdom.
That's true.
And we come to find that most of the fools are very intelligent. And that is why we see the decline of Christianity in the West. And I think that our great hope is for a reformation, a restoration, a revival of the very truths of the Bible, and to go back to what Jesus has brought into the world, which caused the advance throughout Italy, Rome, and brought the gospel into the world. If we today would take serious the Great Commission and go forth into Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the world, and come to understand that in Jerusalem, it's those people that are like us within the church. They look like us, they seem to have the same ideas, and then when you go into Judea, they look like us, but they are very worldly. You go into Samaria, and they have much more different ideas than us. And when you go out into the world, if you've gone through this progression, you've come to understand that there is a difference, a significant difference of culture and the gospel.
Well, I don't oppose a re-Christianization of the West by any means, but I don't think, well, first of all, I don't see any signs that that is happening. And I think that we have to concentrate on the national racial question. At least that is certainly my area of concentration. And I'm not convinced that a re-Christianization of Europe or of North America, for example, would necessarily lead to the kind of mental reawakening that I'm talking about. As has been pointed out earlier, so many of the churches today, I mean, they may have some sort of evangelical mission, but they are just as crazy and just as suicidal as any group of pagans or atheists. So, as I say, I'm not opposed to re-Christianization. I just don't see any particularly encouraging prospects for that on a large scale, and I'm not necessarily sure that that is the first or basic or essential step to achieve what I want. Yes, sir.
Well, I'll have to disagree with you on that point, and I still think that you overrate intelligence and underrate character, but what do you think about my theory? I think just being a Democrat makes you 30 points stupider.
30 points what?
Stupider.
Well,
Just thinking the word Democrat, you just get, I think it, I don't think black people have, their problem is genetic. I think they're like that because they're Democrats. And I don't think we have a Democrat problem in this country. And that's, and that's, I believe in the devil, and I don't believe God is a Republican, but I believe the devil is the founder of the Democratic Party.
the black people in Haiti are not Democrats.
No, we did. but they are pagans. And I think black folks now they're still idol worshipers. It's just their idol is
The black people in northern Nigeria, some of them are Christian. The black people in southern Sudan, many of them are Christian. But Christianity has not lifted them out of the kind of poverty and backwardness that strikes Americans, black people where they are. The same is true. The same is true for blacks in the United States.
But you
they are
can't
more
say
likely
that.
to go to church than white people.
You can't say that and just brush away the 500 years of backwardness of Asia.
Of Asians.
Yes, Asia was incredibly backward. China and Japan for centuries were just as backward as Nigeria is today.
No.
And everything the Chinese and the Japanese have, everything the Chinese and the Japanese have now came from Western civilization.
No, that's wrong too.
But all their technology and everything like
The
that
Chinese
benefited from it.
The Chinese had a written language in 1000 BC. The Africans never came up with a written language. The Chinese have a literature that goes back to before BC. They have glazed pottery. They have mechanical devices, multi-story buildings. They had a bureaucratic system, a system of government, examinations. To call the Chinese backward in that sense is completely wrong.
If you look at, so did the Babylonians had towers, and the Egyptians.
Yes,
and
they did.
things like that. This is a spiritual thing. It is not a racial thing. And if you try to divide humanity into superior and inferior groups, I believe you're in error, even though I agree with you about what we're seeing in our society. But you can't just discount the spiritual component of it.
I don't discount wisdom and character, but I think that if you do, and many people have done this, if you take the average IQ of all the countries around the world and you compare that to GNP per capita or likelihood to be democratic, you'll find an almost one-to-one correlation. You simply have to have a certain level of intelligence to run an industrial-style society. And also one thing that I would add, as a general rule, intelligence is also highly correlated with honesty of the kinds of things that we often describe as character. Now, it is true that there are many intellectuals who have completely jumped the tracks in terms of many things that are important to our survival as a people. But I think that the biological evidence, the mental testing evidence, the historical evidence, and I think eventually we're going to track down the genes, as this Bruce Lahn was doing at the University of Chicago, the genes that contribute to intelligence. And I would bet the next 10 years' mortgage payments that those genes are not going to be found to be distributed equally in all populations. Now, when this information is discovered, will it be released? I think there will be tremendous pressures not to do so. But I think that the chances, the possibility that intelligence is equally distributed among all groups all around the world is zero. Yes, sir.
We saw in Nazi Germany the rise of evil that has been unprecedented in the history of the world.
How about Stalin?
Yes, with very advanced psychology and philosophies that ran amok, and intelligence did not guide righteousness and right living.
He's right.
I have never said that it necessarily will, but intelligence is a basic prerequisite for a certain level of standard of living. Intelligence is not necessarily always going to guide you in the right direction. But imagine if the people in Rwanda and Burundi, the Hutu and the Tutsi, who killed about 1 million of each other with machetes, imagine if they had been intelligent enough to have automatic weapons, nuclear weapons. I think that, of course, white people have done bad things and white people have done mistaken things. But they have been able to do them on a large scale because of the kind of industrial civilization that they had. I don't think that white people necessarily have any, well, we obviously do not have a monopoly on morality, but we do seem to have a monopoly on some sort of suicidal sentiment. Yes, sir.
I'd just like to say, you mentioned the Christians in Africa and stuff like that as evidence that it doesn't necessarily bring you out of the slums. I would say you have to distinguish Christianity or occultism from biblical Christianity, because if you do not have biblical Christianity, you will come to where we are in America, and you can go to any church, and it's not biblical Christianity. You have to follow God's law for it to have effect upon you. And I just want to make sure that's pointed out, because you can't use people who claim Christ and say they're Christians. Doesn't necessarily mean they're Christians.
Well, I don't want to be in a position of judging who is a Christian and who is not, but it just doesn't seem to me that those groups of Christians or people who claim to be Christian in Africa or Haiti are necessarily living at a level of civilization or culture that is much different from those around them who are not. Yes, sir. In the green shirt.
Would you develop the concept of pathological altruism? You made brief reference to it.
Well, that is a field of study that is beginning to grow in the United States, this notion of pathological altruism. And people will generally, academics will talk about it in terms of individuals. An individual who conceives of himself as benefiting somehow from the misfortunes or the failures of others. People who will be codependent, in other words, people who will do all the things necessary to keep a spouse or loved one an alcoholic, or help them along in this kind of self-destructive behavior. Or, for example, an example that's considered pathological altruism is suicide bombers. They are altruistically doing something to help their group, but at the expense of themselves. This is slowly a discipline that's beginning to take root in psychology. But I've corresponded with some of the people who are doing this kind of study, but they don't want to talk about the idea of whites as a group being pathologically altruistic, and yet I think that what whites show are the classic signs of this. In other words, that they are responsible for the failures of others, and that their prosperity is somehow caused by the poverty or the failure of others. I think it is a classic sign of what is increasingly known among specialists as pathological altruism.
Thank you. That's good. All right. Well, I think we could go on. We could go on and on. We probably should call it. It's 12:16 right now, so we're getting a lot of the. Well, there's a new guy back there. We're getting a lot of the same people involved.
This is very interesting to listen to you, because the last 10 years of my life I kind of developed an understanding about that. When you look at Europeans, and you look at back to ancient Israel, they had chariots, horse-drawn equipment, what have you. And I just seen a documentary a month or so back about the Congo, and how the Belgians were in the Congo and tried to develop a lot of things over the years, and how they were driven out politically, and now all the factories and things, the jungle is all overgrown, and there's still Africans that come there and kind of putz around with it during the day, waiting for the Belgians to come back, which they probably never will. And being a devout Catholic, Jesus said, who is my brother? Who is my sister? He that does the will of the Lord. So that doesn't say that you're not looking at some evolution. You show me your cell phone, and show me that cell phone 30 years ago. There is evolution. There is things changing. And to look at the marriage rate, what have you, in the United States, or you look at the mix between blacks and whites, it's mostly black men who have their children through white women, mixed couples, and that's an evolutionary process. The other way, it's not evolution, it be evolution. So that explains to me why you see the interracial couple being the black man and the white woman. You don't see that always, but premier-wise, that's what you see. And so what you say, I can buy into, and as a Catholic, it makes sense to me that the church has been in Africa for eons of time, trying to help people and what have you. And we spent time, the church was in Vietnam. I spent 2 tours in Vietnam, in the mountains and the highlands, and the people are extremely backward. And so it does make sense, this whole evolutionary thing. And I think because of climate, people don't need to improvise, adapt, and overcome. I mean, people evolve from where Christ was from. I don't believe he comes from Africa. But if you look at how that whole process operated, when they went into Europe, they freeze to death. They starved if they wouldn't improvise, adapt, and overcame. So it makes perfect sense. When you look at Europe today, you look at the space program, none of that is from the lower continents around the equator. They don't need to. They can fish out of water, banana off a tree. They don't need to evolve.
That is the generally accepted theory for those who take an evolutionary point of view as to how racial differences in intelligence evolve. Those who were living in these cold climates, you had to prepare for the winter. You had to think ahead.
Exactly.
Whereas people living in these warm tropical areas, there was food on the trees year-round. They were not the environmental pressures to evolve intelligence and thinking ahead. Furthermore, in the northern areas, you had to have a certain amount of teamwork in order to bring down large mammals. It takes cooperation, it takes thinking ahead, it takes a sense of fairness to divide up the game afterwards, if you have that kind of activity that's necessary for survival. I think all of that is quite plausible. I think it is no accident at all that the North Asians are more intelligent than the South Asians. It's no accident at all that the whites who evolved in the northern parts of Europe, they ended up having to be intelligent simply to survive. You said something earlier also about the people in the Congo, some of them talking in terms of maybe hoping the Belgians will come back.
Yeah.
Well, that's something that you often find, even in the mainstream press. You will find South African blacks who will say, well, things were better when white people were running the show. Or Jamaicans who will say, it'd be a whole lot better if the British were back here. I think that blacks have a kind of a schizophrenic view of this kind of thing. They will say on the one hand,
I would offer that doesn't just write Christ's teaching. Who is my brother? Who is my sister? They are our brothers and sisters, but it's a different style. It's a different time. You're looking back thousands of years when the documentary went into the Congo. They've been living like that for thousands upon thousands of years. So I don't think that conflicts with my Catholicism at all.
no.
And they were functional in their culture.
Who was?
The Africans.
Yeah, but
What
what
people
listen, Pastor,
were a functional.
Pastor, in your brain, in